The Boy in the Alamo, Chapter 10, The Battle. Every now and then, over the gunfire, you could still hear Davy Crockett singing "Come to My Bower," as if he were inviting the Mexicans in. Any of them that got close tasted his lead. The desperate situation seemed to excite him. He got out his old fiddle and went from battle station to battle station, sawing out play party music to rally them in. Every now and then, in my out-of-the-way post, I could hear the thin wail of his fiddle. Most of the time you couldn't hear anything but the roar and pound of the cannons and the shrill shh of the bullets. Lupe crept out of the inside room once, but I drove her back. I walked up and down before the door of the outer room, holding my dirk knife in my hand. I still didn't have a gun. They were too scarce for this kind of detail. About 6 o'clock that night, there was a terrible explosion of the plaza, and I broke my trust and ran to the edge of the chapel and looked toward the north wall. A great jagged hole had been torn in it by the Mexican cannon, wide enough for a company of men to march through. The wall no longer offered us any safety. The air was full of smoke and the dust of the powdered adobe, and the men were running around trying to set up a new position for the cannon nearest the hole. Now there's nothing to keep them from coming through, I thought, and I hurried back to my post. I went to the inner room. "They've broken through the wall," I said to Miss Dickinson. "Only God can help us now," Mrs. Dickinson said, and began to pray. Lupe and Mrs. Mendoza went down on their knees and began to tell the beads of their rosaries. Suddenly the cannonading ceased. A dead quiet fell over everything, for as soon as our men realized the shooting had stopped, our batteries ceased firing. After 5 days of incessant gunfire, the stillness was scary. The hole gaped in the plaza wall, but no one came toward it. Colonel Travis made the rounds of all the positions. He even came to our door. "It is some trick," he said to me, "but let us all take advantage of it and get some rest." Except for 3 sentries placed outside the walls and the lookouts, who still turned their red eyes toward the east, hoping against hope for reinforcements, men lay down where they were and began to snore. Until the guns stopped, they had not known how tired they were. Mrs. Dickinson took Angelina in her arms and lay down in the corner of the room. Mrs. Mendoza covered them with a blanket. Then she sat down and leaned against the wall and closed her eyes, and Lupe was curled up on the floor like a kitten. If it was a trick, I could not leave them unguarded. I stood up and I walked, pacing back and forth before the door. I went to sleep standing up, and I slid down the wall to the floor and knew no more. It must have been past midnight then. Our sentries were relieved at midnight, and other tired-out men took their places. I heard them shuffle past the chapel to the gate. They never came back. They did not live to give us warning. Some time after that, I heard a wild shout. It was from one of the lookouts, who in the light of the setting moon noticed the stirring of creeping men in the shadows. The garrison came to life, mumbling, cold, stupid with sleep that had been too little and too late. I ran into the inner room, but the women were still sleeping. When I got back to the door, the shrill bugle call, sounding the charge, blared out. I ran toward the plaza, and I saw Mexicans begin to pour over the walls on all 4 sides by the hundreds. They looked like black ants. They had scaling ladders, crowbars, pickaxes, knives, and guns with bayonets. A hideous sight. I covered my eyes to shut it out, and as I did, there fell on my ears the most terrible sound I have ever heard. It was the degüello, the bugle call to murder. The military bands assembled at Santana's headquarters and took up the call and swelled it until it seemed to fill the whole world. It meant that nobody was to be left alive. There was no mistaking its message. It was not like any sound I had ever heard, but it made me remember this time Buck and I had been squirrel shooting over toward Coon Creek at home, and we saw a black panther leap out of a pin oak tree onto a calf. "Don't listen and don't look," Buck had said to me that day. So now I covered my ears and I turned my face toward the room where the women were. I could hear gunfire and the sound of falling bodies. And then it was quiet again, and I heard Colonel Crockett shouting, "Tell Santa Anna he will eat snakes before he ever gets over this wall." After a while, the terrible bugle began again. "What is it?" Lupe cried at my elbow. Get back, I hissed at her. "Don't show yourself, they're over the walls." She began to sob. "It is such awful music," she said. "It hurts my throat." "Go back inside and stay very quiet," I said. "If Angelina cries, put your hand over her mouth. They must not know you're here." For what seemed like hours, nothing happened, and I knew we had beaten them off. But as the sky paled and the day began to come, I could hear shrieks and cries and thuds in the plaza from where I stood, and I knew the Mexicans were making their second attack. The barrage of gunfire almost drowned the sound of the bugle, and it was a relief. Then again, everything was almost still for a while. I crept over to the opening, and I could see our men mounted on the platforms with their knives drawn. Colonel Travis was standing at the north wall. With him was Joe, his body servant. Colonel Crockett was at the earthworks. He had a tomahawk in his rifle. About 8 o'clock it all began over again, but this time the Mexicans were forced to our wall by gunfire behind them from their own army at Santa Anna's orders. The noise in the plaza was fierce, and when I ran to the edge of the chapel to look, I saw that the plaza was filled with Mexican soldiers, and the Texians were fighting them. Hand to hand on top of the walls and in the plaza, I went back to my post. There was some timber left over from the scaffolding that we had built in the unroofed part of the chapel, and I dragged it up and made a barricade around the door of the inner room. The women were crouching in the corners of that room. "Don't be afraid," I said. "I won't let them in here." I had my dirk in my hand. How much I wished for a gun. The wail of the Diguelo went on. I do not know how many hours the battle lasted. I was afraid to leave my post and go out. We fought for every inch of the plaza, but they came over the walls and through the breach like flocks of sheep. When they got in control of the plaza, the Texians retreated to the barracks and the stone houses where we had been quartered, and then to the inner room where Lupe and I had played war, fighting for it inch by inch. Our end of the chapel stayed clear for a long time, and then a Mexican came running into it from the plaza. A bullet hit him not 10 feet from the doorway where I stood. He dropped to the dirt floor and rolled over and lay still, with his gun still smoking in his hand. I looked at him with horror, for I had never seen such a thing happen before my eyes. I felt small and alone and not like a man, but a child. After all I had said, I thought I would vomit. Then someone was beside me, and I started in terror at touch. I looked, and Lupe put her hand in mine and said, "I'll stay here with you. Do not try to make me go back." She had climbed over the barricade I had built, and I was too confused to try to make her go back where it was safer. Before I could stop her, she darted toward the Mexican and leaned down and dragged the pistol out of his hand. "Lupe!" I shouted. "Loco! Crazy! Crazy! He may be possuming!" "He is dead," she said calmly. "Here's a gun." Girls never cease to surprise me. She didn't seem the least bit frightened. She handed me the pistol. It was silver-mounted and weighed down my hand. We stood there side by side and waited for what would happen next.